Today's podcast is one that I have really been looking forward to. This is a very dear friend of mine, so we're going to put that out there right away. This is Dr. Yvonne Merrill. She likes to describe herself, and I think it is accurate, as a born-again feminist who is very interested in the topic of what we're going to be talking about, which is about my book, the upcoming book, Helplessness, which is part of a 3-book series from helplessness to hopefulness to happiness. And helplessness is the one we're going to be discussing. And the impact on brothers once they learn their sisters have been molested or raped, primarily in the home. What we carry forward, because in my family, all of my sisters were molested and raped by my stepfather for almost 20 years with my mother's knowledge. And me and my 3 brothers had absolutely no idea what happened and what was going on. And when it did, the devastation behind it for us emotionally was humongous. And it is something that we carried for over 45 years, primarily in silence, like most men do. And if there's anyone who could talk about the aspect of what we're going to be talking about today, is how women at times can use their victimhood as a weapon against men, especially those men who are innocent. And in my case, it happened with my sisters when we were told we cannot talk about it ever to anybody. And so if anyone helped have this discussion with me, it is Dr. Yvonne Merrill, who is a very dear friend of mine. So to me, she is always Yvonne. How are you, Yvonne?
I'm great. I'm very pleased that you gave me a sort of nice segue into the historic problem with women weaponizing their words against men, because we saw that in the women's movement when women became very militant at some time, and there was an extraordinary social backlash, not just from men, but also from women. And then later in the Me Too movement, when women finally felt empowered to speak out and to accuse men in power, there was, again, an incredible backlash. But with the last one, women felt a little stronger because of their numbers, and the time is right. And so the time is right for this book, because one of the things that I study is how we are linguistically, in our interactions, constructing our own version of reality. Mm-hmm. And what we perceive is how we do. And I was not violated to the extent that your sisters were, of course, but I was molested, both as a child and as an adult, and that had a lasting effect, just as it would you. But this is my takeaway from your book that's most important to me as a feminist, is that a violated woman of color is at the bottom of the social hierarchy and most helpless, because her reality simply doesn't count. Mm-hmm. When you think of the social powers that be, who's at the top of the food chain? It's white men, and race, class, and gender all play a part in how we talk to each other and how we can talk within our groups. And within our groups, we have a certain way of talking. So your sisters, I'm sure, talked within their group.
Yeah.
But they didn't talk to you.
Yes.
And nor did they really talk to your mother, because she had alienated them.
Yes.
And your older sister, the one who took the floor when she revealed what was happening, asserted the reality for the girls in the family, and in telling the boys that they had no right to get involved, it wasn't their problem, and they couldn't say anything about it. She guarded her own control over her reality.
Yes.
But in effect, victimized you boys.
Yeah, and we were already made a victim once we found out, but that was being a victim once we, primarily it's because we found out. Because it had already been happening in the home, the energy had already existed, and we just didn't know about it. There were communications taking place between my sisters and my mother and my stepdad. And for a very long time, you had absolutely no idea what was going on there until this day in 1977 when it all came out. So the energy was already all encompassing throughout the house. And so we were a victim and not even aware of it. But when my oldest sister spun around and told us we can never talk about it because it didn't happen to us, we were locked down again. And the challenge for us when that happens, and once we learn, the very people we need to speak to are the ones who are telling us we cannot talk to them, especially when we're innocent of what happened.
Yeah, that was the thing that struck me the most, was you got swept into this victimhood. And as I started looking at my socio-psychological hierarchy that I came at through Jennifer Coates, she's a feminist philosopher, and I'm generalizing from her major premise that class has the most to do with how we can control our reality, whether we can control our reality. But if you take in race and gender, white men are on the top. All classes of white men are on the top. Upper, middle, and lower.
Yeah.
Just beneath them are upper-class white women. Just below them are middle-class white women. And roughly equivalent to them today are upper-class black men, the people who have some wealth, who are professional, who've been successful in the dominant culture. And then below them, we have the lower-class white women, and that's roughly equivalent to middle-class black men, which you can see where I'm going with that.
Yes.
And after that, lower-class black men, who are therefore lower than lower-class white women.
Mm-hmm.
And then after lower-class black men, you have middle-class black women, and then you have lower-class black women. Well, you can position your family situation in there, and your mother and your sisters are both basically lower-class black women. So they're both the bottom of the heap and feel the most powerless of anybody. So what they're going to do is when push comes to shove, your mother had it worked out how she could survive this thing. And, the kids would get food and shelter. But the girls who had been used to some finer things, thanks to their singing career, and knew their relative power as singing family, just decided that they were not going to tolerate being, used as sex slaves by this man who is obviously feeling pretty powerless himself.
Yes.
The only power he has is the power over this family. And so that entire apparatus, has been in place a long time. And now you're giving voice to the fact that lower-class black men are almost as victimized, if not more, than lower-class white black women. But the lower-class black women could, in fact, use their support because they're men. And men are slightly higher on the, the animal.
So you're saying that black women who are victimized can to use the support of innocent black men who have not done any molesting. In a sense, they can become allies and help each other. So my question for you is, how do brothers overcome being told that you cannot talk about something? Because to my view, the entire family has been molested and raped. We may not be the direct victims, but we are without question an indirect victim. And everything that happens from that moment on impacts everyone in the family. Because once that happened to me, when my sister did that, and it took me a while to understand what she was doing. She immediately went into the role of protector, not only for herself, but for my three younger sisters. And once I understood then I was okay with it, but the pain still existed. And with me and my sisters and my brothers, we never talked about it for almost 40 years. And so the burden as a brother of not being able to talk about it, we never even talked about it amongst ourselves. I imagine my sisters did. And there are systems in place for women that allow them to talk about it. There are groups that they can connect with. But brothers and men, there is absolutely nothing for us. There's nowhere for us to go. So how do we handle this?
Well, there's no cultural history in the West, at least, and it's surely in the East, because I did a lot of Eastern Asian studies too, for men to uncover their own emotional feelings. There's been no language for them to learn growing up to create a reality of their own emotion. And so if they can't talk about how they feel, and the first thing that should have happened in your family was that early on, when the kids were growing up and working together, they talked to each other, not as girls versus boys, but as siblings who are all in this together.
Well, that's what happened. We were extremely close growing up. I mean, we did everything together. We played together. We worked together. We studied together. We traveled together. So our relationships were fantastic. And it wasn't girls versus the boys. It was just one big hodgepodge of just activity and friends and love. And we had all of that until that day in January of 1977, when it all came crashing down. And then we fragmented and we broke apart to such a degree. It was very, very devastating.
Well, it is, and both sides of your family, both genders, were psychologically tongue-tied, because how would, say, a 10-year-old girl talk to her 8-year-old brother or 7-year-old brother about what their stepfather was doing to her? How would she even say that? You mentioned in the book of when you suspected what I think it was your 8-year-old sister was in third grade or something like that, and she went the next day to school and nothing was said about it. And she never let on that and the guys, they like their sisters, they play with their sisters, but they don't spend a lot of time talking to their sisters about sex, particularly. And no man, and probably not mothers in those days, would spend a great deal of time talking to their sons about it.
This is true.
So the sons have no vocabulary for reaching out to sisters in distress, and the sisters have no way to conceive of their brother actually being able to understand what they lived through.
Right.
And I think that's the issue, and it's an issue of emotional linguistic development, and emotional intelligence is something that we're now addressing in a fairly large way in elementary school. When we were working out bullying, bullying was part of the fact that boys don't know how to talk through their disagreements.
Yeah.
They slug them out, or they tease them and they badger people. They don't know how to work through their frustrations. Whereas little girls, they cry, they're encouraged to run home to mommy or even daddy and tell them the problem, and then mommy or daddy will go see if they can sort things out. But that's not the way little boys are trained, They're trained to suck it up and stand up for themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's really difficult for kids, even in a big family of half boys, half girls. It would be very, very difficult for them as children to articulate to each other their emotional needs in such a crisis, because it's so unnatural, as you point out. Everything about it is unnatural. And the beauty of your being able to write this is when you write it, you have absolutely articulated every feeling that you had at every particular step of the way. And that would be difficult for any man anywhere because of our not having that training. And I think it was only by virtue of the fact that this was such a profound experience for you, and you had the ability and the strength of will to analyze it and not let it get buried in your subconscious, but to keep picking the scab,
Yeah.
going after the pain.
Yes.
And saying, this pain has got to be analyzed and addressed. And that's unique. That I don't think you'll find anywhere else. I know we have men, and we have a lot of Jewish men who write, and they often, do, a lot of navel gazing about the effects of their mothers on them, and, their sort of Freudian sexual fixations and that, and they're even very popular writers. But, that's a man's experience from a privileged man, and he can say that, and a lot of white men and Jewish men and even non-Jewish men say, oh, yeah, I get that. Now I know how to talk about this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have ever if he hadn't articulated it,
Well, it is certainly something that in the Black community we rarely ever talk about, and we rarely even admit that it happens. We tend to want to protect, at least from a Black man's standpoint, our masculinity, because that is the one thing, without question, that has been handed over from a white man's perspective. When it comes to masculinity and it comes to athletics, you guys are spectacular. That is so, it is important that we, the Black community, maintain that status, but it comes at a cost, and the cost is the emotional cost. And for my family, I've got my 3 brothers, I've got my 4 sisters, and I have my older half brother in Portland, who were brought into this web by this spider, and the spider being my stepfather. And then my mother, who knew all along what was going on, and she allowed her daughters to be sacrificed, to be abused. And so she abandoned her responsibility to not only her daughters, but also to her sons. Right. And so we carry this emotional burden, men do, in silence. And I had an interesting conversation last year with a woman who is aware of the manuscript, and she said to me, unlike the girls, you boys chose to carry the burden. And I was taken aback, because what man or boy would choose to carry the burden of knowing their sisters were molested or raped? From the time we were told about it, the burden was handed over to us, which is okay. I don't mind carrying it. But to say that we chose to carry this is so not correct. But I get the sense, in speaking to other women about the book, that same rationale exists with other women. What do you think?
Oh, I really don't think so. I would not agree with that statement. Because, as you said, preliminary to that question, is you said that we were handed our masculinity, and that gave us one leg up on the rung, and that also gave us the equal responsibility of being protectors. And whether or not your sisters had turned to you, you would have felt that way when you found out, because you're a man, and that brings into question your manhood, and that would be something that I think most women could understand, because that is the defining characteristic of men in most of the cultures. They are the protectors. they are the providers and they are the protectors, and given that they do that, they have certain rights over other people. And that's what your stepfather had. He thought he had rights to your sister and to let your, keep your mom enthralled to him because he was a man, and that inherent sense of needing to be a man, and I'm sure that your other brothers may not even have thought they could do anything about it except be outraged, and be ashamed, because they say, that's shameful. That looks bad for us socially, for us to stand there sitting on our hands or whatever when our sisters have been violated this way. What's wrong with us?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that sense is not one that you chose. I think that sense was culturally constructed historically in just about everywhere you can imagine.
Yeah.
That is man's burden, and you wouldn't have chosen it. You inherited it, and then you got swept into this particular one because you had no choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think most women today understand that women are never liberated from their roles of subordination until men are liberated from their role as know all, be all, protector of all.
Well, I'm going to push back on you a bit when you say that you did not agree with my assessment, and I'm going to push back because I have had conversations with a number of women, and I start to talk about the book, and the first thing that I hear, it's a knee-jerk reaction, is you can't talk about it. It didn't happen to you. And so where I understand where that comes from, but what I'm saying in the book is that we can talk about it. We need to talk about it because it's not just women who are victims, it's the entire family that has been victimized. And if we are to go forward in being able to help each other, we have to create these alliances. You and I talked the other day, and you've been very instrumental in helping me put this manuscript together. You have been just absolutely spectacular in helping me do this. You and another gentleman, George Kennedy. And you told me the other day as we were talking about potentially doing this podcast, that after reading the manuscript, you thought about articles that you had authored in the past. And from the perspective of a woman and what a man may be thinking or may not be having. And you told me that after reading the book, my manuscript, Helplessness, you would go back and rewrite those articles. What was it about the work that I did that caused you to say that?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily rewrite the articles. Your book affirms what I've always suspected, and that is that you can't affect any sort of social change by telling the person who's in a little more power than you are, you can't talk about this because it didn't happen to you. That's a knee-jerk reaction, like you said. A lot of women still have it. A lot of women had it back then because the fact was that the only way they could control the way they coped with what had happened to them was not to share it with men and to keep men at arm's length when it came to that topic. And that was a very bad move on their part. That's kind of like telling Black people today in Black Lives Matter that white people can't talk about us, which some people do. You can't talk about us because you didn't have the experience. But what they need to do is say, you need to understand our experience. Talk to us.
Yes.
Talk to us about our experience. Don't just talk about your experience. We need you to talk about our experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've got to have this dialogue. And that's where I'm going with this idea, is that the dominant culture, whatever it is often willing to talk about it, and maybe even willing to come at some solutions. But they sometimes get shut out by the victims because they haven't lived that experience. They don't have the lived experience. And so what they both need to do is, let their hackles down,
right,
and say, well, let's just talk.
Well, it's interesting for me and my sisters and brothers, who, as you know, contribute to the book. Three of my sisters contribute. They have pieces that are in the book. My older half brother and my older full brother also contribute to the book. But you're going to get a family perspective on this whole thing.
That's good.
How do we go forward? Because I found that once I was able to talk to my sisters, and it went almost 40 years before we even talked about it. My brothers and I, as I said, we never talked about it for over 40 years. But once we got to talking about it, we understood each other. And it was so liberating to talk about it and understand what this sister was feeling, what this sister was feeling, what this one was feeling, what this brother was going through, what this brother was going through, and never having any clue what they were going through, but only just assuming, certainly from my brother's perspective, that they're feeling the same way that I am, and it's trapped because just not able to talk about it.
Well, they'd been shut out. They'd been effectively shut out from the very beginning. And what I think is rather remarkable that you point out is that you and your older brother and your older half brother all have been victimized by an older Black authority figure. And
well, I don't know about my older half brother, but myself and my older brother, we were molested by our babysitters almost daily for 6 months, 6 years before our sisters were molested.
And remember how when your half brother, and I like the way you depict him in the book, is when he figures out what you're doing, he's there. When he figures out that you're going to take this action, and he's going to be there with you.
Mm-hmm.
But the initial reaction of your older brother and of you when you heard from your sisters exactly what had happened was devastation.
Yeah.
I mean, just absolute, complete devastation, and a lot of crying and a lot of, shame and guilt pouring to the surface. And the way you described that enabled your sisters to go further with what they were willing to share.
Mm-hmm.
And because they began to see your emotional response, which they didn't have any clue how you would respond. And as children don't really have that kind of experience.
Yeah, possibly them, but I was scared to death to approach my second oldest sister about the prospect of writing this. I knew I was going to write it at some point, but I needed to talk to her and let her know this is what I want to do and ask, are you okay with it? And for 3 months from the time I thought about it, I put it off because I was so afraid I would get the reaction, no, you can't talk about it. It didn't happen to you boys. You can never talk about it. Get that reaction from her that I got from my oldest sister. It just locked me down.
Yeah.
Yet, once I finally found the courage to talk to her, her response to it was something I wasn't expecting. She said, well, of course you can write it. You need to write it. It's your story. It's not my story. It's not us girls' story, but it's you boys' story. And you boys need to tell your story because men need to hear what you're feeling, what you've dealt with, because it can help them as well. I was not expecting that. I was so afraid to approach her. And then it gave me the courage to speak to my other sisters, and the reaction was exactly the same. Not what I was expecting.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't expect it because, if they had sublimated that whole experience enough to get on with their lives and do what they had to do. It had 40 years to solidify. And you could have come in there and upset the apple cart, and you probably suspected that if you broached that to them now, it would just upset this little condition of stasis that you've been in for 40 years.
Yeah.
Where you're not talking about it, you're not confronting your mother or your stepfather, and you're not helping each other out to overcome your personal traumas. And you didn't know whether that would be helpful to your sisters or not for you to tell your story, because you were afraid that might just make them feel exposed again. And
then it would make things even worse. There would be no opportunities in the future of ever having a relationship with them. And these are people who the memories of us playing not only on stage together, but just memories of just fun and picnics and holidays. For me, you long for those type of events and those type of feelings to bubble up again, but they can't unless these people are involved in your life. And so you're kind of stuck because you still need to have this conversation just so you can feel better about yourself.
Yes. Well, your mother's depiction is very nuanced and very complicated, and Lorraine Coates, a philosopher, had something really interesting to say about that, if I may.
Sure.
She says the veneration of mothering practices works to suppress and or condemn ambivalences, characteristics of mother-child relationships. Mother love, maternal thinking minimize the darker psychic forces at work that shape these mother-child relationships. And the darkest manifestations of child abuse reveal that the power of these forces showing, social anger and ambivalence created by a false assumption of some form of universal mother love. And so she throws these parties for you. She tries to give you good memories. She has this sort of idealized view of mother love, and she can make it up to you. She can shower you with this kind of maternal attention, and you will forget that she has completely abandoned you as human beings in the force of something that neither you nor she can control, and so that really was striking.
Wow. Wow. That was very, very good. That was it for sure. It reminds me somewhat of the chapter in the book, The Parent-Child Contract, and when it's broken and how we try to hang on to those emotional connections with our parents, even when we know the damage that has been done. But how you described it was that was very good. Yeah.
Well, it's true, because what we consider naturalized roles are just that. They're naturalized by society over the course of time, and we often find ourselves in positions of ambivalence and anger and frustration at being in those relationships that way, because they're not good relationships. They're terrible relationships in which just about everybody is under some kind of social stressor that doesn't allow them to fulfill their naturalized relationship to each other. And that's really tragic, because we've seen more and more of that in dysfunctional families of every kind. People just don't know how to be parents. They can't begin. Kids have never experienced genuine parenting. They don't know how to handle situations because they've never been engaged in conversations with teacher figures, and mentor figures who can help them come to terms with the fact that their relationships are awry. So, and that's why your book is so valuable, because if it can get into the hands of people who actually are in those roles, like sociologists and churches and counselors and anybody in a position of helping young people particularly in the most important relationship of their lives until they marry, is their parents, their relationship with their parents.
Yeah.
And every psychologist will tell you, well, first we talk about your parents, right? Tell me about your mother.
Right.
So yeah, it really is very key.
So if I could ask you, what type of advice or words would you offer to sisters to help them help their brothers understand what has happened to them, how the brothers might be able to help them, and then by extension, the brothers can then help the sisters just through the conversations? How should this take place?
Well, I'll have to do a little role playing here, but I think I can from my own childhood. Had I had brothers, I think that would have been very helpful for me. I did have a father. He was rather distant, and I couldn't imagine telling him about what my granddad did, because I was to be seen and not heard. I was to do what I was told, and God forbid that I should have emotional issues that I would bring to him. You know, that was not his role as dad. So I gravitated to boys my age, and I imagined myself, even when I was like 8 or 9 or 10 years old, infatuated with these boys simply because I could talk to them. And what we would do when we would play house. And they would be the dad, and I'd be the mom, and I'd have my dolls, and we'd talk about things like, are you going to take the baby for a walk today? Or, you know, is it time for us to have dinner and with the baby, and all those kinds of things. I needed that kind of closeness with a male figure that could stand in for my terror of older men not understanding that I thought I'd gotten myself in that position because I wanted to be loved.
Right.
You know, I wanted to be loved, and if a man, particularly an older man, makes love to me, I mean, cuddles and kisses and all those kinds of things with me, I was very happy. And but I didn't have any men to do that. And so I was kind of gravitating to boys. And I'm thinking, if sisters, they don't think of they wouldn't have this problem, because they wouldn't think of their brothers as romantic partners at all.
Correct.
They would just think of their brothers as a stronger person who's male, who might conceivably be able to help them out and give them support with whoever's the abuser, you know. And I think that's the message that we're really trying to get across, is that girls don't shut out men in general, and particularly men you're close to that you can talk to. And don't be afraid to tell them how you feel.
Well, that's easier said than done because of the emotions behind it.
Right.
You know, that's just watching my sisters was extremely challenging.
Right.
But we've got to start at some point. With Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, as we begin to wrap up here, is there a place where you see this conversation? Is there a place where it fits in what is going on with the current political and social climate and cultural climate, having this conversation that I'm looking to bring forward?
I'm beginning to see some really hopeful signs, because I'm beginning to see a lot of institutional support for revealing the private and family life of Black families. You know, and how they relate to each other is often somewhat different from the dominant white culture, and they have their own culture. And if they can explain that culture to someone not in that culture in a way that they can sympathize with them, which I think is possible.
I think at the end of the day, there needs to be some resources for men, because as we talked about earlier, there are resources for women who have been victimized, but we men need to have some resources that allow us to talk and express what we're going through, express what we're feeling.
Exactly, and that's the bonding under the hood thing. It's got to go into the locker room. It's got to become part of the culture in which men feel comfortable, and so coaches have got to be less like, kill each other on the field, be aggressive, rah your teammates, but also people who take into consideration their family situation.
Yeah.
Who are thinking about, whether their mom is a single mom, whether their sisters are going bad or have been put out on the street to help raise money for food. And, those kinds of issues, that's where your book needs to go. It needs to go where guys are getting mentored. There's this Australian ex-priest he's got this card club. He calls it a card club. And all over Australia, he's rented these garages. And it's mostly for men who are just at loose ends, who don't know how to relate to people, who are having devil of a time doing that. And so he brings them in, and he says he's got tools. They can bring in projects. They can do whatever they want. They can come in and work in his little workshop. But the gist of it is he feeds them, coffee and donuts. And most of the time they just sit around talking about their lives and getting help from each other, sort of a male support group. And we've done that for other issues in schools and in churches. So there's no real reason why boys couldn't be getting this support.
Well, I would love to be part of or start a foundation that deals with these types of issues for men, so we can get not just a conversation going on in the home, but also taking place in our local neighborhoods and take it onto a more national conversation. If you have any last words that you'd like to share with us about where this is going, what this is all about, I think would be fantastic.
Well, just that I think it's going in a very positive direction, and I think that the society at the moment is ready. It's receptive, and I think that's a good sign. It doesn't mean that they can be persuaded or that anything will happen immediately, but I think that the ideas will be heard as long as you just get them out there. So however it can be shared, I think that there's a receptive mood that would be willing to listen, and I think that's an important thing.
Well, Yvonne, thanks so much for this time. It was valuable. It was exactly what I was hoping for.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's something I'm interested in too. Very much.
Okay. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, all right. Bye-bye.
Bye.